Okay, I think we're winning. Good evening, good woch. Nice to see you all. Good to be back. It's been a while. Standing in tonight for Rabbi Aaron Rose, who sadly is sitting shiva. He lost his father just before Shabbos. So take over from him tonight. We're going to delve into a new topic, the laws of Tchum Shabbat. So it's still the laws of Shabbos, but just a different area of Shabbat in terms of where one is allowed to go, what the limitations are in terms of the space that we're allowed to move within on Shabbat. So the Torah tells us that there are limitations. We've got to remain within our own domain, not just carrying items from one domain to another domain. In this case, is going to be defined totally differently from the Rishuyot, from the various private, public, intermediate domains that we've seen in the laws of Shabbat until now. So that's basically the laws of Tchum Shabbat in a nutshell. And let's get right into it by looking at our text here, which would be, I think, this should be it. Sorry about that. There we go. All right. Hope you're seeing the correct screen. Can somebody just give me a signal? Are you seeing the text there? Just put it in the chat for me so I can know we're doing the right thing. But we'll assume that we're seeing it correctly. And here the Torah tells us that one who goes out of what's called the Tchum, as you can see here, one leaves the Tchum Shabbat on Shabbos, receives lashes, and the Tchum is the name for the city's sort of city boundaries. And whenever it says punished by lashes, as we've seen elsewhere and previously, that actually means that it's a Torah prohibition. And the Torah tells us, no man shall leave his place on the seventh day. Place in this case doesn't mean you got to stay home or you got to be stuck on the couch and you can't stand up at all during the whole Shabbat. Place refers to the city limits. So the Torah tells us there's a city, there's limits, and you may not leave that place. There is no Torah definition of the measure of this limit. So the sages have an oral tradition that tells us that when the Torah says, do not leave the city, it means 12 mil. What is 12 mil? 12 mil was the length, the size of the Jewish encampment in the desert from one end to another. We had the Mishkan, which was in the middle of the encampment, and then the Jews would camp, the Levite camp around that, and then in a square around that was the Israelites' encampment. From one end to the other was 12 mil, and the idea was that all Jews could come and visit the Ohel Moed, the Mishkan, the tent of assembly, on Shabbos. So that is where the oral tradition of that 12 mil limit comes in. And that is Moshe saying, don't go beyond the camps. That's the oral tradition that explains what is a Torah prohibition. 12 mil would be quite generous, probably equivalent to about 12 miles, slightly less, 12 kilometers perhaps, is the biblical mil. As sages ruled that a person should go only 2,000 cubits beyond the city. And going beyond the 2,000 cubits is forbidden. 1,000 cubits is 2,000 cubits is more like a kilometer in distance, more or less. So that's a decree, a gezerah. The Torah says you can go your 12 mil completely, and the sages say you can only go that distance of the 2,000 cubits or the 1 mil. Quite common in Jewish laws that we find that there are Torah prohibitions that are of a larger scale, larger measurement, and a rabbinic prohibition that limits it quite a bit beyond that, or in this case, beneath that. So we have the Torah prohibition allowing you to travel the 12 mil, and the rabbinic prohibition allowing you to travel the equivalent of 1 mil. Now, a lot of this is so irrelevant to our city dwellers because the city in itself is considered one tchum. Those limits only kick in once you get to the city boundaries, and whether you're living in Cape Town, Johannesburg, you can really go very, very far. Durban, wherever you may be, you can really go very, very far until you get to city boundaries. You get to kind of not just suburban areas, because as long as there's still homes, it's still called the city. It's when it gets into farmland. Beyond that, then the houses are very sparse, that we're talking about being beyond city limits. So basically, you can go anywhere you want within limits of Shabbos with that restriction. But it's important. You can go on holiday. You can be out places where that would be relevant. So why the rabbis go with the 2,000 cubits? And they talk about something called migrash ha'ir, and that concept of migrash is already mentioned in the Torah. When he talks about the cities and how they were set out, the cities of the Levites in particular, and there was the cities, and then there was a 2,000 area of pasture land that surrounded each city. So the 2,000 cubits around the city are considered to be part of that city. Here we have an illustration of how you would count that. So it follows that a person may walk throughout the expanse of any city, even as large as Nineveh. In Nineveh, biblical Nineveh, it says that it was 3 days walk from one end to another. So that's kind of the biggest city that's mentioned biblically. So it's a very large city. You can walk within the entire city, even if it has a wall or not a wall, that's irrelevant. And similarly, it's permitted for a person to walk 2,000 cubits in all directions outside the city. When you calculate those, and let me see if I can keep the map that they're drawing on the screen. When you calculate those, the entire area is considered to be a square, like a tablet. So the area in between its furthest corners will also be included. So the city may be a round or oblong shape or whatever it is, irregular shape. We're going to draw a square or a rectangle around the city. And we'll see it further down in Rambam, I think, in the next chapter, that we actually go with geographical cardinal points here, north, south, east, and west, and we'll draw straight lines, irrespective of the shape of the city. It'll be a straight line here, a straight line there, etc. And the 2,000 cubits will start in the directions of C. So A being the shape of the city, B will be those corners that you are gaining as a result, and C being the cubits and 2,000 in each direction. So, if, for example, the city limits are here, if you think about it, you're actually getting more than 2,000 cubits, because the 2,000 cubits only start, from here onwards. So you're gaining these corners. There is a question whether a person is liable if he goes beyond the Shabbos limit, traveling at a height of more than 10 handbreadths above the ground. If he jumps from one pillar to another, when none of the pillars have a surface area of 4 handbreadths, about 4 handbreadths. So there remains an unresolved question among the sages whether or not the Shabbos limits apply 10 handbreadths above the ground. So technically, if you want to link two cities that are a distance apart, so there's 2,000 cubits and then there's a gap, you want to create some kind of a pathway where you jump from pillar to pillar with handbreadths. It's not clear. So that is a questionable, and therefore don't do it in the first instance. But obviously, if it was transgressed, then it would be questionable and doubtful whether you have transgressed or not. What does this do for airplane travel? Doesn't work. Or flying carpets, doesn't work. The matter is one in question, only an instance similar to the example given. But if there is a surface that is 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths, it's the same as walking on the ground. So I think that traveling on an airplane would be more than 4 handbreadths. And besides all other questions involved, there's definitely an issue of Tchum Shabbat. If, for example, you're on the plane on Shabbat that lands, late on a Friday night, and the question would be then, is there an issue of Tchum or not? Speak to your local Orthodox rabbi for a ruling on that one. You'll have to call him from the plane before landing and hope he can give you a good answer there. And a nice leniency. The last thing you want to be is stuck in an airport for 24 hours. Person spends Shabbos in the barn, in the desert, in the corral, in the cave, similar type of private domain. Okay, so you're not in a city. How do the laws of Tchum apply when you are outside the city already, and now you're staying, in a barn in the desert, or any kind of a dwelling? So the rule is that you can walk the entire space in which you are. That's your kind of your private domain, the little cottage, the little bungalow that you've got up there in the middle of nowhere. And then beyond your private domain, you can then go 2,000 cubits in each direction from that domain. Same if there is no dwelling, so to speak. A person spends Shabbat in an open valley. He may walk to the limits of a square extending 2,000 cubits in every direction from the place at which he is located at the commencement of Shabbat. Even if he was sleeping at the commencement of Shabbat and didn't consciously acquire the place as his Shabbos base. Normally there has to be kind of a conscious decision. This is where I'm spending Shabbat. This is where I'm going to be. But if you're asleep and Shabbos comes in, obviously your intention is that you're going to be there for Shabbat. So you're going to be considered to have acquired the place as your residence, fixed your residence as that place. And we'll come back to fixing places of residence in a couple of chapters when we talk about the concept of Eruv Tchumin, where you can actually kind of extend artificially by acquiring residence in the place other than the one that you're actually staying in. What happens if you're in an open valley and nobody's measured it? Because in the cities, people are maybe aware of where the Tchum ends. But if you're in an open valley, what do? If you don't know how far the Shabbos limit extends, then it's 2,000 ordinary steps. The idea is a cubit is actually 2 feet. So if you put the 1 foot down on the ground and then you leave a space next to it, I'm not going to show you with my feet on the screen, and then you get the space, and then those 2 feet, those kind of 2 feet will together combine to form 1 cubit. So that's the Shabbos limit. So if you take normal steps where you take a step and you leave about the space of a foot and then put your hand in front of it, that would actually be considered about a cubit. So 2,000 of those, that's the Shabbos limit. Here's an interesting situation. You walk your 2,000 cubits that you're entitled to walk, and your limit ends in the barn, a corral, a cave, a city. He's then allowed to proceed only to the end of his limit. We don't say that since his limit ends in the private domain, he's entitled to walk throughout that domain. So he started walking here, that's where he was. He walks up until B, and then he ends up being in a city or another private domain. His limit is from A to B. That's 2,000 cubits. We do not say that he gets the entire domain altogether. But this is only if his limit applies in the middle of the city, in the midst of the cave. So imagine that this is the city or the cave that he's come into. And if his 2,000 cubits end in the middle there, then that's it. That's where it ends. But beyond that, if the private domain is included, imagine that this private domain is actually shifted further and ends before line B, then the private domain is included in the 2,000 cubits. The entire domain is counted only as 4 cubits, and the remainder of 2,000 cubits is calculated accordingly. So should the private dwelling or the city, whatever it is, fall within his 2,000 cubits, that doesn't count. You count the entire area as only 4 cubits, and you then got another. So say you traveled 1,000 cubits, ended up in a city that, whatever the city may be, 3,000 cubits or 4,000 cubits long, but the entire city is contained within your limits, you then are able to carry on. So let's talk about the 2 examples. Okay, you come from here to here. This was your starting point. You arrive here, and you walk into a city, but the entire city is somehow encompassed in this area here. Okay, so you calculate, city started here, that was 1,000 cubits, the entire city fits in within the 2,000 cubits, therefore from the end of that city, I can walk a further 1,000 cubits, or actually, to be technical, 996, because you count the city as 4 cubits. However, if it's only interlocking as in the drawing, then that wouldn't work, and you're still entitled only to your 2,000 cubits. So if there are 1,000 cubits from the place a person establishes his base for Shabbos, and from the town in which he spent the Shabbos to a city or cave, there's 1,000 cubits long or less. He may then walk through the entire city or cave that he encounters and continue beyond it for 996, because we've counted that city or that area as 1,000 cubits only as 4. If, however, in the instance mentioned above, the city or the cave that begins within the Shabbos limits extends 1,001 cubits, the person may only proceed 1,000 cubits that is to the end of the 2,000 cubits granted him, but no further. So then his tchum would actually end in the middle of another city or another private domain. A person whose Shabbos limits end in the middle of a town may nevertheless move an article to any place within the town by throwing it. So the laws of Tchum Shabbat and the laws of Tul Shabbat, which we discussed in previous chapters, that tell us where or not we may carry things. So those laws are unrelated to the laws of Tchum Shabbat. Yutchum is where you may walk, and you arrive at the end of Yutchum, provided you're in a private domain, and you would be allowed to, if not for the rules of Tchum, to move an object from one to another. You may then move the object. So say you arrive from the one direction in town with a very important letter or message, which you have to hand over to somebody who's coming from another town, the opposite end. And he kind of gets to his 2,000 cubits, and you get to your 2,000 cubits. There's in the gap in between. You can't really get to each other. Then you cannot walk over to one another because you mutual limits have ended here. But provided you are in an area where it's permitted to move objects from one to the other, you can throw the document, the letter, the object to him. Obviously, you don't want to miss, because if it falls in the middle, then neither of you can get there. So you throw, he catches, and there's no issue there of moving objects between one domain and another, because the laws of Tchum, the laws of domain are totally unrelated. Martin, I've just picked up your question now in the chat. Apologies. It is not a circle. It is a tradition, which we will come back in subsequent chapters, and how we know that it is actually north, south, east, and west, and it's a box that is drawn around the city. It doesn't go by a circle. Person spends, paragraph 8, bottom, person spends the Shabbos in an open valley. Gentiles surrounded with an enclosure on Shabbos. So now, do we say, well, they created a private domain because they built a wall around it. Can he now walk as far as he wants? No. He may still only walk 2,000 cubits, even when the measure is included within the enclosure in any direction. However, once it's become a private domain, he can move an article from one end to another by throwing it, provided it was enclosed for the sake of habitation. So that goes back to the laws of carrying from one domain to another on Shabbos. If an open area is enclosed with walls, and that those walls are there for the sake of habitation, then it becomes a private domain. So you can clearly see that the laws of carrying and the laws of Tchum are totally distinct, and what's considered an enclosure for the one is not necessarily an enclosure for the other. Here's a rule where you're in the midst of a journey. You intend to enter a city, and you arrive within 2,000 cubits of the city before Shabbos commences. Even though you didn't arrive at the city until after Shabbos had commenced, you're permitted to enter, to walk through the entire city and continue for 2,000 cubits outside of it in all directions. So essentially, because you were traveling into a city and you're within 2,000 cubits of it before Shabbos comes in, that is at dusk, at nightfall, therefore you actually are acquiring your residence, fixing your residence within the city of on Shabbat, and that becomes your location in the city. You can travel around that city all around. The following rule applies when the person is in the midst of a journey, intends to enter a city, but fell asleep on the way, doesn't awake until after Shabbos has commenced. He awakes, finds himself within the city Shabbos limits. He's permitted to enter, walk through the entire city, and continue for 2,000 cubits outside of all directions. So you don't actually actively have to accept upon yourself consciously the fact that this is your intention, this is your journey, this is what you're doing is sufficient. That's because his intent was to journey to the city. Therefore, it's considered as if he established his place for Shabbos together with the inhabitants, since he entered into their limits. Here's an unfortunate situation. 11, the person has left the Tchum Shabbat, and he went out even one single cubit beyond the city's limits, may not re-enter. The rationale is that the 4 cubits a person is granted in which to walk begin from the place where the person is standing. So he's allowed to, where he is, move 4 cubits in each direction and no more. So since the person went a cubit or more beyond his Shabbos limit, he must remain in this place. He may not walk except in the 4 cubits that begin from the place in which he's standing and continue in a forward direction, and that's it. Similarly, a person who's even 1 cubit outside the city's Shabbos limit when darkness falls shouldn't enter the city. Instead, he may proceed only 2,000 cubits from the place where he was standing when Shabbos commenced. If a person's Shabbos limit ends in the midst of a city, he may proceed no further than the end of his Shabbos limit, as has been explained. So he is outside the city when Shabbos comes in. He cannot walk beyond that area, and he's 1 cubit outside of the 2,000 cubits. Before we talked, he was already within the tchum, and nightfall came, but now he doesn't make it. He's even 1 cubit outside of that limit. That's it. He may not proceed beyond the 2,000 cubits for where he is when night falls. Even if that limit would then extend in the middle of a city, he is limited to 2,000 cubits. The person's feet, one of the person's feet is inside the Shabbos limits, and the other outside, then he may enter. So that's called, 1 foot in either camp. But if you get 1 foot in, you're in. If a person left the Shabbos limits unintentionally, Gentiles took him outside the limits, he was possessed by an undesirable temperament, whatever that means. Look at the footnote, an evil spirit would be literally, and that means he went for sugar, whatever it is. So he decided he was going to go out the city, but it's not willingly, it's not intentionally. He's possessed, he's forced, or inadvertently. He may walk no more than 4 cubits. If he returned within the previous Shabbos limits voluntarily, he still may walk no more than 4 cubits. If the forces that caused him to depart returned him, it is as if he never departed. So if it was he didn't know it was Shabbos, he forgot, he left, he came back, or he was arrested by the police and taken to an outside area, and then they brought him back, or he was he was possessed, and then he realized he came to his senses, but then he was repossessed and came back into the city limits. He would then be allowed. It's as if it never departed. If these forces left in a private domain, then he may walk through that entire domain. If he inadvertently left the Shabbos limits and entered a domain of this nature, became conscious of his actions while in this domain, he may walk through that domain. So if he's in a private domain, he's left the tchum, or he's been forced to, or he made a mistake, whatever it is, and ended up in a private domain, as in a dwelling, a cave, then he may, his 4 cubits is then considered to be that entire dwelling. Person voluntarily left Shabbos limits, he may walk within the 4 cubits, even when he was returned to his original Shabbos limits involuntarily. So he left on purpose, and he's standing there, and his next door neighbor sees him standing there and says, "What's going on? Why are you standing?" He says, "Oi, I don't know what I was doing. I left the city and I've just done tshuva, and I'm stuck here for the next 18 hours until night falls tonight." And his friend, his next door neighbor, says to him, "Are you crazy?" Grabs him, puts him in the back of his car, drives him home. Okay, so now he was taken there voluntarily, but he's coming back involuntarily. He is limited to 4 cubits when he comes back. Similarly, if he voluntarily left, he may only walk within 4 cubits, even when he is in the private domain, if it was voluntarily. Person sets out in the sea. He may walk throughout the ship, carry throughout the ship, even if he's outside the Shabbos limit that he originally establishes as Shabbos base. That is, the ship is considered to be a private domain. Person leaves his Shabbos limit unintentionally and is surrounded by an enclosure. He may walk through the entire area of the enclosure, provided it doesn't exceed 2,000 cubits, remember, unintentionally. When this enclosure that is created without his knowledge overlaps part of the Shabbos limit that he left, additional leniency is granted. Since he is allowed to walk through this enclosure, he may re-enter the Shabbos limits. Once he enters, he may proceed freely as if he never left. So he leaves unintentionally. He's then surrounded by an enclosure. He can walk through that enclosure. If that happens to take him back into his city limits, then he's in business. The following rules apply even when any of the individuals' movement is restricted to 4 cubits, must relieve himself. So you get stuck. You're outside. The ruling is whether you left on purpose or you came back on purpose, whatever it is, you're limited to 4 cubits. What happens then? If you need to relieve yourself, then we say that dignity, human dignity, takes precedence in this case, and you can leave those 4 cubits, move an appropriate distance, and then return to your place. If when moving away to relieve himself, now this is really something that is left to your integrity here, the person enters a portion of the Shabbos limits he originally left. Since he entered his city, and then it's as if he never departed. But that's only if he originally left unintentionally. If left intentionally, then he's still stuck to the 4 cubits, even if he re-entered his original limits. The following rules apply, and this is interesting, to individuals who are sanctioned by the court to leave their Shabbos limits. So who is allowed to, by law, leave their Shabbos limits? Witnesses are going to testify regarding selling of their moon. And all others who are allowed to depart because of this mitzvah. You may recall, no, you do not recall, you're going to get to it soon in the next set of laws, which is laws of Kiddush HaChodesh. It's very important for witnesses to testify when they've seen the new moon, so that Rosh Chodesh can be determined. And for that purpose, you may even travel on Shabbos beyond your Tchum Shabbat. So you're actually going for a mitzvah, and therefore you're allowed to travel. You're doing this with rabbinic sanction. When you reach your destination, you may proceed 2,000 cubits in all directions. We're not going to say that you are stuck in your place because you were doing it for a mitzvah. Should they become located in the city, they are governed by the same rules as the inhabitants of the city, may proceed 2,000 cubits beyond the city in all directions. When a person was sanctioned to depart for Shabbos limits, in the middle of his journey, he's informed that the mitzvah he intended to perform has already been performed. For example, they arrive and they say, oh, you're here to tell us about the new moon. Don't worry, the Beth Din already declared Rosh Chodesh. Other witnesses came. He may proceed 2,000 cubits in all directions from wherever he is. If a portion of the Shabbos limits from which he departed overlaps these 2,000 cubits, he may return to his original place. It's as though he had never departed. All those who depart from the Shabbos limit to rescue Jewish lives from Gentiles, from a flooding river, from an avalanche, are granted 2,000 cubits in which to walk from the place where they rescue them. When Jews are rescued from Gentiles, but the Gentiles' position is strong and their rescuers fear spending the remainder of the Shabbos day in the place where they rescue them, they may return to the original space carrying their weapons. So that's a question of pikuach nefesh. So we get two things at play over here. First of all, you went for the purpose of a mitzvah. When the mitzvah is completed, the laws of Tchum dictate that you stay where you are and within 2,000 cubits of the place that you are. You're not limited to, your 4 cubits, your immediate area, you get the full 2,000 cubits. But if you are now afraid that it's dangerous to remain, then the Pikuach Nefesh says, go wherever you need to go to be safe, including going back to your original place. I want to wish you all a Shavua Tov. It's been good to be back. Apologies for having dumped you the way I did, but Yontif came along, and that was it. We moved on, and somebody took my place. Actually, I may have mentioned this, but there are 2 sequences of learning Rambam. There are 3 chapters there, 3 chapters a day, 1 chapter a day, and I'm actually personally studying the 3 chapters a day, so I'm in a totally different area of Rambam, and that has made it a bit difficult for me to keep up with it. But it's lovely to see you all back. I see the stalwarts are here. I don't see Terry. He was always there. Shavua Tov.